Donald Trump is cracking down on immigration and promising to build that wall. But is the border with Canada the real problem? The Investigators starts now.
We'll begin immediate construction of a border wall.
Twice as many known or suspected terrorists encountered trying to get into the U.S. from Canada than there has been over the last 2 years from Mexico.
Fear in the U.S. seems to be driving more and more asylum seekers to flee north to Canada.
I managed to get a couple of phone numbers, one of a driver who brought people to the border.
I remember telling him that he was hurting me and to stop.
Police dismiss about 1 in 5 sexual assault allegations as baseless.
Police forces are reopening a lot of cases as a result of these revelations by the Globe.
I think it's amazing, and I'm really excited for all of these people who I spoke with who trusted me with their stories.
I'm Diana Swain. We are the Investigators. This is what we do. President Trump says he's just trying to keep Americans safe and keep the threats out. But a new investigative report suggests the problem isn't who's getting into the U.S. from Mexico, but who's getting there from Canada. Trump has moved quickly on his promise to build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. The barrier intended not only to keep out illegal immigrants, but also to stop terrorists.
Collusion that they're having with Islamic jihadists and terrorist organizations. So we have to be able to secure that southern border.
But that narrative is being challenged by investigative journalism done by the Daily Beast. The website obtained FBI documents that suggest far more suspected terrorists are trying to get into the U.S. from Canada than from Mexico, an allegation Canadians have heard before.
Sources telling CNN that 2 of the hijackers apparently crossed from Nova Scotia, Canada by ferry.
Government officials and regular Canadians worked for years to dispel false media reports that some of the 9/11 attackers crossed into the U.S. from Canada. But as Jonna Winter's story in the Daily Beast this week suggests, the northern border remains a major concern in Washington. So, Jonna, let's talk about the data that you got. What does it say about the number of suspected terrorists trying to get to the U.S. from here?
That there's twice as many, in some cases more than twice as many, known or suspected terrorists encountered trying to get into the U.S. from Canada than there has been over the last 2 years from Mexico.
Now, in terms of suspected terrorists, what does that mean? Because we've certainly heard a lot here about kids, for instance, who have the same name as someone else ending up on a no-fly list.
Right, and we share our no-fly list with you, so you would obviously also know about those problems. Our watch list system has long been criticized for being way too broad, so it could mean you are, a terrorist. You have the same name as someone who is being investigated, or you could be associated with a certain group from a certain country. It really covers the gamut.
I'm wondering, though, what kind of reaction your story has generated.
Well, I've gotten a wide range of reaction. I think most shocking that some of the law enforcement officials and also congressmen and senators who live and work in border states had no idea that these numbers existed. So the U.S. is so busy focusing on Mexico. I was provided these documents to show actually these are the real numbers. So how about we have a discussion about what's actually happening? The trend towards the northern border has been increasing substantially, which doesn't mean that Mexico is still not a threat, but it seems sort of ridiculous to be focusing on one border when the other one is right there.
Now, I know there's going to be skepticism on this side of the border. We talked about 9/11, where, no less than Hillary Clinton was going on for at least a year after that attack, saying that the attackers came from Canada, which they did not. In your view, these documents were given to you anonymously. Could it be someone just trying to take attention off the Mexican border, saying, I don't believe in the idea of a border wall, and throwing Canada under the bus?
Respectfully, I think that's ridiculous. No one's trying to throw Canada under the bus. I think that what's happened right now in the U.S. is that there's a whole lot of rhetoric and absolutely no data. The numbers, the amounts of people who come in from where and what capacity just aren't released. And the FBI has them, and I was given them, frankly, by sources who largely agree that there should be some sort of border wall, but who think both sides need to be looked at. Plus, the more that you're on TV talking about the southern border as the only threat, as one of my sources pointed out, if you were a terrorist trying to get in the country and you weren't incredibly stupid, you would probably go to the border that isn't being, the focus of every single conversation.
What reaction have you gotten from Canadian officials?
The Canadian Embassy in Washington reached out wanting to make very clear that there is no one who has entered the U.S. from Canada who has succeeded in carrying out a terrorist attack, which is, of course, super important. There are, however, been instances where they have crossed the border into the U.S. with plans to carry out a terror attack, but those attacks have been foiled. I'm referring mostly to the millennial bombers. Certainly no one is, again, trying to throw Canada under any bus. It just seems we have two borders. One of them is with you, and that happens to be the longest by far land border in the world, and a good 4,000 miles longer than the Mexican one. So we should probably be looking at both.
Jonna, good to talk to you. Thanks.
Thanks.
This week, it has become clear it can be easy to cross the border undetected.
This is one of the areas where they have found to be the best spot for them to cross.
A U.S. Border Patrol officer takes the CBC's Karen Pauls on a tour of the Minnesota-Manitoba border. And though he's worried about people entering the U.S., the traffic recently has been flowing in the other direction.
His hands are frostbitten and bandaged, the result of hours in the freezing cold.
They said I'm going to lose all my fingers.
This Ghanaian refugee almost died trying to make the crossing late last year, and he's not the only one. Since the Trump administration announced its new immigration policies, the number of people crossing the border into Manitoba has spiked.
Just drop me to the border. I'm black. Come on. If I drop you to the border, you're going to die.
Last weekend alone, 22 people crossed the border into the Emerson, Manitoba area. Karen Pauls went to Minneapolis to find out more about what's being described as a refugee pipeline.
Just across that barricade there, that's Canada. And this is how easy it is to cross the border on foot.
So who's behind the pipeline? How did it come to be? That's what Karen Pauls has been trying to figure out. So Karen, we're talking about people who are essentially trying to sneak over the border in the freezing cold at night. The question is, how on earth are they even getting there to begin with? And who's telling them that they can cross safely when clearly in many cases they can't? So your assignment, find the front end of that pipeline. How have you done that?
Well, you start at the back end and you talk, we spent hours sitting on apartment floors talking to the refugee claimants about their journey and specifically how they got from Minneapolis to the border to Winnipeg. So hours and hours of conversations with no cameras rolling, and we managed to piece together some information about where to go if you get off the bus in Minneapolis, who you might be able to talk to. I managed to get a couple of phone numbers, one of a driver who brought people to the border and another community leader who might be able to get us some ins in the community. At the same time, of course, talking to people in Minneapolis to see what they know about this and what they'll tell me. But we found that it's really hard to win people's trust and confidence on the phone or on email. So we needed to go to Minneapolis, where we are right now, to have some FaceTime.
Now, I know you talked to one of the drivers who has taken people near the border. You know, I wonder, does he understand what they're up against trying to cross? We saw that one man may lose his hands. I mean, it is the deep, dark part of winter right now on the prairies, and it's no sure thing that they can cross safely.
Exactly. And the young man we spoke to really got a sense of that, I think, for the first time earlier this week when he says he did his first drive to the border. It was a friend of his who said, you know, I need to get out of here. Can you give me a ride? And he said, sure. And then he shows up and there's 2 or 3 other people waiting to get into the car because they heard that they were also going to the border. So he gets there and realizes it's too cold. I can't leave you here. You're going to die if you walk across these fields.
Obviously, there are many people who are asylum seekers who have found their way from Somalia, for instance, into the U.S., worried they're going to be sent back to Somalia, and that's part of what's driving them north to Canada. Are there concerns, though, being expressed by anyone you've talked to, that there are people who are, a security risk who are trying to get in and who are getting in?
It's something people are watching. So far, they haven't seemed to have found evidence of terrorist activity crossing at this place, that most of these people seem to have some kind of refugee claim, and that the people actually doing the driving, it's not organized crime. It doesn't seem to be that sort of a situation. It's more of a clan-based family, you know, you and I went to school together, so we're cousins, and now you need to help me and I'll help your family member when they need help. And that's sort of what's happening. And with this very large Somali community here in Minneapolis, there are a lot of connections, there are a lot of people who understand that journey, and a lot of people who understand the serious dilemmas these people are in right now and just trying to figure out what to do with their lives and how to move on, and fear that they'll be deported at any point from the United States back to a country that still has some unrest.
Karen, thank you.
You're welcome.
He was over top of me.
A Globe and Mail investigation suggests many women reporting sexual assault are routinely disbelieved by police.
This has been a 20-month project.
We'll look into the challenges of investigating that story with reporter Robyn Doolittle. That's just ahead. Plus, why are some public servants getting overpaid while others still aren't getting paid at all? It's one of 5 things we learned from investigative journalism this week. But first,
can I answer the question? No, I do. There's clearly some confusion.
The relationship between the Trump White House and journalists was probably never going to be great.
So the Secretary of Homeland Security just stood up, and so you're calling him a liar?
You didn't say so. The specifics.
Jonathan, I'm talking to Glenn.
The tense moments between Press Secretary Sean Spicer and the press corps have given comedians plenty of material.
I would like to begin today by apologizing on behalf of you to me.
In reality, the tension shows few signs of abating.
I understand the total dishonesty of the media.
Now some are backing away from a 97-year-old tradition in Washington, the Correspondents' Dinner. The evening brings journalists, politicians, and celebrities together for a glamorous night of laughs.
Here I am at another one of these dang press dinners.
There are doubts the president will even attend the dinner.
President Trump going to go to the White House Correspondents Association?
I don't know. I mean, the idea that that's a priority.
He wouldn't be the first president to skip the event. Ronald Reagan didn't go in 1981, but he was recuperating from being shot. After recovering, he tried to play for some laughs.
Mike Devers, in his book, said that I had a short attention span. Well, I was going to reply to that, but what the hell, let's move on to something else.
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. S-Trip, a company that sells vacations to high school students, says it will review its policies after a CBC Marketplace investigation showed the trips aren't as safe as advertised. Customers and former employees say the trips often result in underage drinking. The Toronto Star reported some personal injury law firms in Ontario have been breaking the rules designed to prevent false and misleading advertising about their success rate. CBC News found the federal government is struggling to recover $70 million mistakenly paid to thousands of civil servants by its troubled Phoenix Pay system. A whistleblower told CNN the Venezuelan embassy in Iraq sold passports and visas for thousands of dollars to people who weren't Venezuelan. The government denies the accusation. And an investigation by the Globe and Mail found Canadian police routinely dismiss about 1 in 5 sexual assault allegations as unfounded, a rate much higher than for other serious crimes. That story, which has already caught the attention of police and even the Prime Minister's office, wasn't contained in a news release somewhere. The Globe and Mail had to push hard to get those numbers from Canada's police forces, and the reporting has exposed a real problem.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Video of a young woman being interviewed by police in London, Ontario. The footage obtained by the Globe and Mail as part of a nearly 2-year-long investigation. The 18-year-old has just told police she'd been sexually assaulted at a party near her dorm.
I kept saying, like, you're hurting me. Like, stop, you're hurting me.
But the officer decides her claim is unfounded, in other words, untrue. Investigative reporter Robyn Doolittle wanted to know how often that's happening, and after pushing for data from nearly 900 police forces, finds that over 5 years, thousands of cases were classified as unfounded.
Shame on Brock!
Reporting on sexual assault can be difficult. Data can be hard to find. In 2015, CBC News looked at how universities were tracking sexual assaults on campus and found many weren't keeping track, or the record keeping was patchwork. So how did Robyn Doolittle get the information she needed to tell her story? And how did she convince women who'd already at least once not been believed to tell her their story? So let's begin with how you collected this data, because it's not as simple as picking up the phone and saying, hey, can you send me the numbers?
Well, I tried that first, and then that didn't work out. So summer 2015, I just felt like I could not go a week without having a discussion with somebody about how the system was failing sex assault victims. This was Bill Cosby, Gomeshi, the Hunting Ground documentary. And that's when I learned about this thing called unfounded rates, which I'd never heard about. So I initially tried StatsCan. They don't collect it. I tried just calling police services to ask for it. They said that they weren't going to release them to me. So I realized I was going to have to go through the painstaking process of freedom of information and, identifying. There were 180 police services and 1,100 police jurisdictions. So we had to send out hundreds of requests to try to get this information.
And it took how long to get it all back?
It came out in 2 phases. So I initially just targeted 50 police services because I wasn't really sure what I was going to get back. So those started in June 2015. It took about 7 or 8 months to get the bulk of them back. And that's when I sat down with the editors and we realized if we're going to do this, we should do every single police jurisdiction. So those went out in April 2016, and there are still some outstanding, actually.
These stories around sexual assault can be really fraught for journalists because there's such a trust issue among the person telling you a very personal story, and then you've got to assure yourself that you've got something legitimate. And the numbers were backing it up, but how did you connect with people who were telling you their stories?
So I started by emailing every rape crisis center and counseling center in the country. There's probably about 100 that I initially sent some requests to, and then within their own networks, they started putting the word out and putting words on message boards, and people slowly started calling me. To your point, in most cases, I was able to obtain additional records related to their complaint. So I encourage everyone to file for their police file if they're not accessible to the public, but the complainant can usually get them. And Ava, the young woman who you showed at the beginning of this clip, that's how we got that video, is she applied for her file for us.
What's really important is the impact that they've had. Her case is being looked at again, no longer considered unfounded. Now the RCMP say they're going to revisit this mass of cases that across the country have been marked as unfounded. People always want to know, what's it like for the journalist when the story that you've done has some impact? So what does it feel like?
I think especially, when you do something, this has been a 20-month project, and kind of towards the end of it, the last couple of weeks, you're just kind of thinking, I have my feelings about how important this is, and you're never really sure when you lob something like that out into the world how it's going to be received.
Right.
I thought that people were going to be angry. The response this week has been crazy. We've had federal cabinet ministers calling for major reviews. The Prime Minister weighed in. There's something, I think, at New Brunswick, all the police services in New Brunswick are going to be doing unfounded reviews. You have the Ontario Provincial Police, now the RCMP. I think it's amazing, and I'm really excited for all of these people who I spoke with who trusted me with their stories, who are seeing action as a result of it. They're all, texting me. They're all really excited, and they feel like something was worth it for them.
It's really good work, Robyn. Thanks.
Thank you.
Many nights he's in a bathrobe watching TV or wandering the halls.
Does Donald Trump wear a bathrobe? I know, who cares, right? But that news story detailing the new president's loungewear says a lot about his administration's relationship with journalists. My POV next. First, investigators on assignment.
I'm Stephen D'Souza in Flint, Michigan. The water crisis here may have passed from the national headlines, but is still very much the reality for people who live here. As you can see, they're still tearing out the lead pipes, and they still have a long way to go. There's also some very difficult work being done at the local schools here to help the more than 5,000 children affected by lead in the water. We'll have their story coming up in the days ahead on CBC TV, radio, and online.
Every week, we invite you to ask me anything about investigative journalism. So here's this week's question. Is it ethical to report a story when you're only able to get one side? That reminds me of an editor I had years ago, and I remember saying to him, I got both sides of the story. And he said, Diana, there are always at least two sides to any story, which is great advice. Here's what I think is important. You need to be sure that you have the facts, that you have the information, that you know what you're saying is true and that it's fair. But you don't need to have everyone's voice. And the reason for that is if you're doing a story about someone who has done something wrong, maybe it's a fraud, for instance, they aren't going to want to talk to you. And you can't decide that you're not going to do the story unless you have their voice in it, because that really gives them the power to decide whether that story gets exposed or not. So it's not about having everyone's side in terms of making sure that they have their voice in the story, but it's important to make sure that the story is accurate and that it's fair. Hope that answers your question. Want to get under President Donald Trump's skin? Apparently, the surest way is to deny him what he considers his due, the reverence that comes with his office.
In the New York Times, it had all sorts of interesting details on the inner workings of the Trump White House.
Among the details in that Times report, a suggestion that Trump watches TV at night in his bathrobe.
That is literally the epitome of fake news. I don't think the president owns a bathrobe. Definitely doesn't wear one.
It's actually kind of absurd. The White House felt it even needed to address that part of the story. And frankly, if he is wandering the White House at night, I hope he's wearing a bathrobe. But who are we to roll our eyes? The president knows how to get under the news media's skin, too.
You've seen what happened in Paris and Nice. All over Europe, it's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported.
Come again? There are times it feels like we barely finished talking about one terrorist attack and we're on to another. But in our own, we don't even own a bathrobe moment, journalists all over the U.S. quickly started pointing to past news coverage as proof they do indeed report on terrorist attacks.
Regarding the entire White House list of 78 attacks, Fox News properties covered all of the major ones.
San Bernardino, I was there. I was also in Orlando last June. That was on the list also.
With one comment, Trump got the narrative off his actions and got journalists defending themselves over an allegation that was pretty absurd to begin with. We took the bait, and now he's not the only one who looks exposed. I'm Diana Swain. We are the Investigators.